of Adoption Congress 13th International Conference, April 11th to the 14th, 1991 in Garden Grove, California. This is program number D151, tape 17.
Because unfortunately, the interest in older children adoption has not been a high priority at any of these conferences. So we're glad you're here. And since this is a very small group, I think what we'll do is try to make this a very informal type of presentation and really talk about some of the things that concern you. So, though you are here, though, and what we would like to do is just give you a very brief presentation of some of the things we want to share with you, and then have a discussion and find out a little bit about what your concerns are. We're very, very fortunate here to have Sarah Berman with us, who is the director, I think of it this way, really, I think it's the largest adoption agency in the country.
Largest public adoption
largest
program.
Public agency in the country. So you really have a rare opportunity to, is this not working? We need two of them.
Yeah, you have to pass it back and forth.
Yeah, okay.
Just try not to bang it.
Wow. Better hold it. Anyhow, those of you who are here, I think you're in for a real treat, a real rare opportunity to to question and to learn from someone who's really dealing with some of the most difficult problems in adoption, I think, that we're faced with. And again, I wish that we could have, that this conference could give more attention to those problems. What I want to share with you, I'm going to try to abbreviate this very much for you. Okay. First, I want to share a concept with you that I think is very important to older children adoption, and that is what I call front loading. And front loading really means basically that all of the resources, or many of the resources, okay, I shouldn't say all of the resources, but a good many of the resources in working with older children are spent in that very first phase. In other words, you're confronted with a problem, and it's usually a very serious problem. And I'm thinking now the experience I had in New York City, where I was invited to a meeting, conference on older children adoption, where they're faced with horrendous problems, as I'm sure we are here too in most of your major cities. And it was very clear, and the workers who came were very upfront about it. They said that their efforts are in front loading. I have to explain what I meant by front loading. That is that the social service staff and the legal staff particularly devote a great deal of their time in getting a relinquishment from the birth parents. In other words, freeing the child for adoption. And it means often going into court. Usually it means going into court. And when that's through, then they're on to the next case, and they said they just have no choice. And when I began questioning this, they said, well, just come with us on the beat and you'll see what we're up against. So I could understand that. On the other hand, it just seemed, if you can look at it objectively, as though there's something not right about it. Because children were being placed there in homes that were going to present horrendous problems for the adoptive couples. And once the children were placed there, by and large, they were, as one couple put it, they said they were like hanging in the wind. They were on their own and they knew it. And they spent thousands of dollars in trying to help the two children that they had adopted, and really felt pretty bitter about the fact that it had not been made as clear to them what they really were up against. Now, they admitted the fact that the workers who they talked to did say that to them. They did say these are going to be problems and real problems. They spelled it out. The couple didn't hear it. That's all. They didn't hear it. And I think that more could have been invested in helping them to hear it. The other thing that the couple asked to pass on was that they wish more time had been taken, much more time in that whole process, and that the finality of the whole adoption, once that front loading was over, really hit them. And one of the parents was an attorney, and they said they understood exactly what that meant. You know, they had a choice of relinquishing, and they just could not do that, so they stuck with it. So this business of front loading is something that I think has to be addressed. I'm not going to say anything about guardianship, believe it or not, because we've talked about it most of the morning, and if you have real questions about it, we can discuss it some more. Basically, though, what Annette and I have been saying is that the system of relinquished adoptions, we're questioning it with infants, and we certainly question it with older children. That there has to be something that does not just sever the child's rights, his connections with birth parents. I want to read something to you that I think says it pretty well. And this is an article, a part of an article that was written by Elizabeth Cole. I don't know if that rings a bell for anyone here. But Elizabeth Cole was associated with the Child Welfare League of America for many, many years, and a very knowledgeable person who's dedicated most of her career in working with older children in adoptions. And she, in my view, has always been sort of the expert in this field. And this is what she had to say. Many of us who work with children have noted their strong emotional ties to their parents, even after those same parents have neglected, abused, or abandoned them. We have seen youngsters run away from excellent foster homes where they would have been well cared for to be reunited with parents by whom they were mistreated. Clearly, the family connection is vitally important to the child and needs to be preserved. At its best, maintaining contact between parent and child makes eventual family reunification easier. The family members have not become strangers to one another, but even when we are faced with parents who defy our best efforts to enable them to take responsibility for their children, parents, for example, who cannot be redirected from a dependency on drugs or alcohol, even then, it is important to maintain some contact between parent and child. Why? Without confronting their reality, children are likely to fantasize about their absent parents and will be unwilling to work on building realistic relationships with foster and adoptive parents. Or the children may think themselves to blame for the separation. If I were good, my mother would have kept me. And that's certainly something I've experienced over the years in child welfare. That under the worst of circumstances, unless there is some reality put into it, which means contact with the birth family or extended family, children tend to blame themselves. And it follows they decide they are too bad to be accepted by any parent, which means it makes it difficult, if not impossible, for that child to settle into a new home. These children will behave in such a way as to make their self-assessment come true. Our charge to protect the youngster does not extend to protecting the child from knowledge of his or her family situation. I certainly hope we've gotten beyond that in our practice of social work. Because when I started in social work, we used to do that. We would be very selective about the information we gave. We would say, for instance, if the child, if there was a background of mental illness, for instance, why would we pass that on to the child, to the parents? It might predispose them to look for problems. Well, on the surface, it sounds like there's some logic to it. You know, if you did that now, you'd be open to lawsuits, and parents have been sued agencies for not giving them the information. Okay. Okay, it does include helping the child to deal with reality. Okay, and this was written a number of years ago, and I think it's very apropos. Okay, the other thing I wanted to share with you, and I'm not going to be able to really share all of this with you, but it's a research study that was done in one of the Carolinas, I think it was North Carolina, And it was called Whose Child Am I? And it was written by John Powell. Anyone familiar with that? Do you know him? Well, he wrote a wonderful book, and I think it's one of the best books I've ever read on adoptions. I had the privilege of reviewing that for a journal, and you know the book? Yeah. Well, the wonderful thing about that book is that he did something unusual. He went back and interviewed adoptees as young adults who had been placed for adoption as young children. And these were 3 to 16 years old, the whole range. And he got some of their responses. So let's see. Let's see if I can select a few here. Well, rather than read them to you, then see if I can just summarize some of the findings. Several of these first of all, they said things like, they wish that they had had a much bigger say in selecting the family. And John Powell concluded that they would have done a better job in selecting the family than the social workers who selected the families for them. Okay, so the message there was pretty loud and clear, that with older children, they must have a primary role in selecting the family. The other thing that they said, and this I find very apropos to what we've been discussing this morning, and that is that many of them felt that the legalization of the adoption, which was something that we pushed for, and I say we because I was caught up in that as well, that when we placed an older child with a family, we wanted to ensure that the child was going to be adopted by the family. And somehow we saw something magical in that if the child was adopted, then he surely belonged to the family. Okay, and that too, is something that you can accept and easily buy into. And these youngsters said, first of all, they felt locked in. Once they got into the home and were told, this is your adoptive home now, they felt they had no choices anymore, that they had to make it. And they were told that too, and I can remember that as well. We've placed few children from the residential program in adoptive homes, not too many at Vista. I don't know, Jay, are we placing any now? Okay. And we would tell the children that. We would say to them now, this is going to be your permanent home, and you want to make it, particularly an older child, Well, these kids felt they got to make it, and they're just locked into that home, and they did not want to be locked into the home, and for many of them it was wrong. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think another piece of that work was that they felt that they were somehow losing allegiance to their birth family, that they could no longer hold on to the dream of returning or having any kind of relationship.
Mm-hmm.
That was a part of John.
Yes, right.
Was that grief process of, they didn't want to let go of fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
It made it harder for them to fit in either world.
We have placed a few younger ones, let's say 10 years or younger. I just recall one adoptive. We have one down now.
Mm-hmm. Okay, here's something I am going to read to you. And this is a older child who had been placed for adoption at about age 11, I think. And he says, mother, he refers to his to the home he was placed in. He refers to the parents as mother and father. And in foster home placement, it's not an unusual phenomenon. A child is placed in a home, particularly a younger child, and it doesn't take them very long before they're calling the foster parents mom and dad. So why does that happen? And it seems to me that in foster care, I've seen it happen where things were going well in the home, where it was the right placement for the child. and that the child then began to feel and allowed himself to begin to see this as the family that he was growing up in. Where it didn't work, it didn't happen. See? And the legalization of it did not make a difference to these children. That was not what made it for them. It was what happened in the relationships within the home. So anyhow, this youngster said, mother often said, I wonder what it would be like, he's talking about the adoptive home, I wonder what it would be like if I had my own child. Here she's throwing in this feeling of her own. What was I? I still don't know. It confused me to this day. Adopted kids shouldn't be given the feeling that they're different. As an adopted child, you should have an extra somebody who loves you, not one less that you've got to be cut off from. I thought it was very profound. It should be taken and growing and increasing a family, not cutting one off from the other. My mother, what he's saying here is that in being placed as an older child, that he shouldn't have to lose a family. It shouldn't have to mean that he loses a family. And he's talking about his birth family. My mother-in-law's understanding of that situation is greater than that of anyone else I've run into. She didn't ask me to call her mother, but said, I just want to be your good friend. I couldn't love you any more than I already do, even if you did call me Mama. I don't want to divide your loyalties any more than they already are. I'm here for you. Okay. And then he says, if you're older, even if you're adopted, you don't give up the feeling of where you first belonged. You can't lose that. I can't lose the feeling that even as bad as my real father was, he existed. Okay, there are lots of examples of that. Okay, I'm not going to read you any more of these. Basically what some of these older children were saying was, one, they need a say in the placement. Two, they don't want to be locked in. That the legalization doesn't provide them with the security that we thought it would. And that they need to have some contacts with their birth family. So I think I'm going to stop there and let Sarah talk about her experiences.
Share your microphone.
Yes, that's got a tape down. Take it off.
As Ruben said, I'm Sarah Berman, and I'm really delighted to have an opportunity to speak to all of you about older adoption of older children. And the first thing I'd like to find out is, for those of us, what is your parameter of what would constitute adopting an older child, placing an older child for adoption? What are you here to talk about? Anybody?
I don't understand the question.
I'm saying, in your mind, when you picture a topic or your own professional work with adoption, how are you defining age-wise an older child? Under 6 months, a year-old, 4, 10, 3, what?
I define it as any child for whom adoption planning is not made at birth.
Okay. Yes.
I was looking at the older child because I got involved with it as between 12 and 14.
12 and 14.
7 on, but I know what 14
Okay.
is great.
Yes.
I think of it as over 3, mainly because I've read about things that say over 3, it's harder to place it.
Okay. So we've got everything from at birth, if nothing was planned for, to teenagers, to over 3. My other question is what kinds of organizations you come from. Do we have anyone here who works in a public agency? Okay.
I did for 10 years.
Okay. Private agencies? Okay. Independent adoption, or just people interested in adoption?
I'm a therapist and I work.
Great. Okay. Well, I'd just like to have an idea. What I want to share with you, and I know in looking at the material, when the opportunity was presented to me to do this panel, I thought that's wonderful. Older children, I thought about our parameters. And I'm going to share with you just some information about California. Okay, this is statewide information, And this is for the last period that the state reports are completed, which is the period that ended last June. Everything is by fiscal year here in this state. Just over 5,000 children were placed adoptively through any means, any legal adoption. This would include an independent adoption that was arranged however it was arranged, a public agency adoption, a private agency adoption. For the children who were placed through an independent adoption, which could have included anything from a woman meeting their next-door neighbor who decided to relinquish to them versus coming to an agency like VISTA who may have known birth parents and may have known, well, no, you're an agency adoption, private agency, any kind of independent. There were 2,162 children placed that way. And what's interesting, when you look at the demographics, of those children, over 70% were with their adoptive families before they were 30 days old. So that when the state measures median age, they do it in terms of the number of days old the child was when they were placed for this particular population. The remainder, if you look at the next large group, it's up to from 1 month to 12 months old. If you take those two categories in the independent, that accounts for 80% of those 2,000 children I told you about. So you can see right away that depending on where you're coming from in your profession and who you're working with and whether you're connected primarily with independently arranged adoptions, your definition of an older child could well be a child in that 6 to 12 month range or over. The difference when you look at children placed through agencies is very interesting. In the public agency placements, and then the children who were placed through agencies were over 3,000. That includes all of the private agencies, anybody licensed, private agency or public agency. So it's over 3,000 children. No, I'm sorry, that's total of agency adoptions was more than that. It was 5,000 just agency adoptions, another 2,000 were independent. But of the public agency adoptions, the average age of the children when they were placed was 45 months. So you can see right away that a child in that age group, that's just our average child. When I say that's just our average child, I mean that as a profession, we need to look at children who are in need of families. We have over 500,000 children in this country in out-of-home care. They're in foster homes, group homes, residential treatment centers, with relatives who may or may not be able to adopt them. And I thought, in listening to the material that Ruben presented, I think a number of important points were made, and some of it, as I was listening to, I was thinking that interviewing an adult today who was adopted as a child was placed many years ago, at a time when perhaps we didn't know as much about what is realistic as we do today. And I'm sure 20 years from now, we listen to this tape, we'll think, oh, did they do that? Because I know some of the people I work with say, when they look at the cases that we provide post-adopt service on 25 years down the road, and they happen across one that they had as an adoption social worker, they can't believe how naive they were about the information they imparted to the adopting family. So this is to say that we've learned a lot. And what we're finding is there's some very significant things that do make a difference. For the children who are available, we are the largest adoption agency around, and I sometimes find that very overwhelming. We're currently supervising about 3,800 children who have a plan for their life of adoption. Many of these children are living in a home where they're going to be adopted, and some are not. And the characteristics, for older children, I think that the statement that you made about, you think about a 3-year-old, that's a pretty relevant number, only because most people, when they come to the idea of adoption, not all, but most, are thinking baby. And what we find is educating people about, A, that there are children available who want and deserve and need permanence, whatever you want to call it. And I'm not going to get into, I will talk a little bit about the legality, because we have some very interesting things that children have shared with us. When you take a look at the characteristics of the children who tend to be a little bit older, what we're finding, and this tends to be true statewide and nationwide, I had the opportunity last year to participate in a 3-week institute where there were people from 20 states, and Elizabeth Cole, who Ruben referenced, was one of the 2 leaders of this institute. And Elizabeth was one of the people who said, I look back on what I thought I knew 20 years ago, and I can't believe it, because we thought we knew everything, and we knew what we knew then, and now we need to do some additional looking. What we're finding about the children who are available is that the majority, although not all, but if you look at the majority, they tend to be children of color, African American children, Hispanic children, and then this next significant group are Caucasian children. They tend to be brothers and sisters who need to be together. Why do they need to be together? Because one of the things we're finding many years down the road is that people will search endlessly, not just for their birth parents, but even more so for their siblings, for the extended members of their nuclear family or family unit. So we make every effort, and I don't mean just our agency, but most agencies, to keep brothers and sisters together. And frequently what we find is if you have an 8-year-old, a 2-year-old, and a 4-year-old, we have numerous offers of homes for the 2-year-old, a few more for the 4-year-old, but not the 8-year-old. And so the more our sibling groups grow, which they do, the harder it is to keep them together. The other thing that we find with the older children, and depending on their age, is a whole range of behavioral problems and sometimes some fairly significant physical and developmental issues. Ruben was mentioning, and I think this is true, and I look through some of our old cases. By old, I mean placements done 20 years ago or more. And they're very, very lovely letters to the adoptive family saying things like, if so-and-so asks you about their other family, just say that they loved you enough to pick us. And life is wonderful. And very significant background issues like the birth mother being hospitalized at the time the child was conceived in a psychiatric facility are not disclosed out of the belief that love conquers all. Well, now, not just because of law, but because of professional ethics, we disclose the significant things about a child's background that will help that child in their life, and that will help the adoptive family to know the child they're adopting, accept them, and provide the kinds of support they may need down the road. So that we're finding in the children that are harder to place that there tends to be a high incidence of fairly significant mental illness in their birth family. And with our younger children in this state, in New Jersey, New York, Illinois, drugs exposure, because that creates an unknown. The easier to place children are children with Down syndrome, cerebral palsy, something concrete. We can place a Down syndrome child of any age at any time. We're giving an adoptive family something very predictable. And what we're finding is that the more unknowns that we ask a family to cope with on a permanent basis, the harder it is for them to take that risk, which makes sense. Because if you say to somebody, we know these things, we don't know the outcome, we don't know what to predict, there tends to be a pulling away. However, we have found, and as I say, most of the children we place are not babies, and they're not 2 years old. They're in that 3 to 7-year-old age group, and then some. We found that there's several characteristics that are very, very critical, both for the children and for the adopting parents. Ruben made the point of it being important for a child to have some say-so about the family they're going to be living with. And this is critical. You know, sometimes we talk at work about it being very much like dating. You know, there could be many people who meet the category you think you're looking for, whether that be tall or in a certain kind of profession or a certain kind of sense of humor, but you could meet 10 like that, and they're not the right one. Or you could meet one that isn't like that at all, and they're the right one. And so with our older children, and by older, we do placement over steps with children who are very young, 3 and 4-year-old children. We do some initial selection based on what we know about the child and what we know about a potential adoptive family. And then go through a series of meetings, lunches, park visits, whatever, with the child. And the feedback children provide is really, really interesting. We've had children who we think that we have picked the perfect situation for. One older child recently who came back after they had 3 meetings that went very, very well. And the 4th meeting was planned to be an afternoon at the adoptive family's home, and that's where he found that they smoked. And that was the end of the placement, because he was aghast that we would expose him to the pollutants. This was a child under 10, but the idea that he would have to live his whole life with smokers was just, to him, unbelievable, that we would even consider that. And we were really at a loss, because in all of the initial material that we looked at, we never ask our children, ever, what do you think about cigarette smoking? It just didn't occur to us. And we talk about a lot of other things. So what the children have to say is really, really critical. We've had children come back, little ones, from visits and tell their social workers, I really want a mom, but I don't think that's the right mom for me. And we've watched also children who, over time, begin to show, I think there's a certain amount of testing that children do, and I think what Ruben was saying about being locked in is very critical. On the other hand, you spend some time talking to children, that's why not just their say-so about the particular family, but their say-so about the idea of being adopted is very, very critical. Adoption is a word that we use, that children will also repeat, but they don't know what it means. And children who are in foster homes and exposed to other children think they know what it means because they talk about it. And for some of our younger children, they think it means disappearing because Bobby got adopted and he went away. Now, where Bobby went to and what happened, because we don't, as professionals, recognize that Bobby in a foster home becomes another sibling to the child that's left behind. So I think part of that is our preparation. But in terms of the issues of secrecy and loss and being transplanted, this is where the child's needs and the adoptive family's needs must mesh. What we're finding is that although there's no way of enforcing it because there's no legality, an adoptive parent is adopting that child's history, their present, their unknown past, and their future. And you cannot deny that, and you cannot disconnect that. And for the families who feel threatened by having that come with the child, the families who, and they very clearly, some families we have found will verbally start agreeing to anything. But as we start introducing other people who are part of the child's life, we begin to see a lot of discomfort. I will meet them at a restaurant, but I don't want them to know where we live. But if you're really so accepting of this person, what is the issue around where you live? So what we're finding is that sometimes in our eagerness to place, and there is that, because as children get older, we get concerned that it's going to be harder and harder for them to place. We look very, very closely at what is the level of openness that this family has for not just the people in the child's life, but the factors that brought the child to where they are today. What is their ability to accept sexual abuse? The numbers that estimate the level of sexual abuse in children out of home care are extremely high. I've heard estimates that are over 90%. In our practice experience, we see that it's very, very common. If you're working with a family who is uncomfortable themselves about sexuality, who has some discomfort about discussing and entering into treatment, or separating out what happened to a child versus what the child is involved in actively. The same thing we find with children who are prenatally exposed to drugs, that in some families, even though they know intellectually that a child does not make these choices for their life, and the child is the victim, in their acceptance of the child, they're denying and pushing these things away. And the more that happens, the harder it's going to be for that child, because you're putting them into an environment where they're not accepted to begin with, as they are. And those issues do not go away. And in some ways, will determine the family's ability to accept that and work with that will determine the success of what's going to happen next. So the child's openness to talk about their own needs, their feelings of safety, and sharing with a social worker what they think of the particular family that they've met, and the family's ability to be open are very, very critical. Another thing that's very critical is the family's motivation. We've found that for families who are adopting the child they never had, okay, or who are going to help that poor child, or who confuse, you see, we say frequently that we're an agency for children, and that we are looking for families for the children that we have. We're not out looking for, we're not doing it the other way. And what we find is that for the families who want the child they did not have, or who want the child, and they're very open about this, they want some guarantees in terms of ability to do a certain amount of scholastic achievement, a child who will fit into their community in a certain way. we stay away from that because we're really setting up both the child and the family. I think the reality that we've come to, whether it be infant adoption or older child adoption, is that what it is a unique experience. It is not the child you didn't have, because the child you did not have, you did not have. That doesn't mean that adoption cannot be an incredibly fulfilling experience, a challenging experience, a poignant experience, but it's not a replacement experience. And that puts a real burden on children. The other thing that I think is very critical, and we've heard from children and families both parts of this, is the idea of permanence. Several of the children that we've spoken with over time, especially some of the older ones we've placed, have talked about an entitlement feeling about having a family, that you go to school and everybody has one. They may not like them, but they have one. And how damaged they feel to not even have one they don't like. And so, I say, because I know Ruben and I talked some about what some of the earlier messages of this conference was, I say that we should not go from one absolute to another absolute. Permanence and the idea of a family is what our society talks about. We talk in family collectives. And I think until such time as we've come someplace else in our social systems and in our legal inheritance, in the caretaking that a child needs, we find that the behavior problems our older children exhibit, and by older I mean 4 and 5 years old, frequently are related to belonging no place, to being moved around and having to adjust. I mean, just picture yourself, and that's why I think so much of this is like dating. Picture yourself having to be intimately involved with a new person every 6 months and adjust to their eating habits, sleeping habits, ways of communicating, mealtime patterns, and so on. We expect our children to do that and to do it in a nice way. No behavior problems, no acting out. Come to this new home. Nobody tells you the new ground rules, but you're still expected to do it. So I think in terms of these issues, there needs to be a lot of reality of what we're expecting the child to do. The other piece that's really critical is support. And we don't mean support when the placement is blowing up down the road. Support before the child goes into the home. So that a family has an idea of what adoption is about, what other adoptive parents have experienced, so that when whatever it's going to be, starts to happen, they're not immediately starting to emotionally distance themselves from the child as a kind of protection. Sure that it's not going to work out. We find, and apparently there's been a study that hasn't been released yet, but it's finding the same thing, that at the time a family calls in crisis, it's too late. They have pretty much disengaged from the child. That it's usually a 2.5-year period where they call, and that's what we're seeing. They'll call for some piece of information. I didn't get such and such kind of a form. Do you think I need that? Or could you help me? With the older children that we place, most of our children are eligible for some kind of financial subsidy and some kind of medical assistance. The early calls tend to be related to something very concrete. Maybe even the second call being referral to a therapist. And if we respond just to that, within 2.5 years, we have a call that says, either from a hospital saying, so-and-so child is on our adolescent ward and can you authorize payment? Or from a caretaker saying, I'm bringing he or she back to you. We've had it. I can't work with this. So the intervention really needs to come early on. And I think part of the problem is we look at post-adoptive support as something that happens after the legalization process when they have a problem. That's not the right way. I mean, we need to be looking at the beginning in terms of education, support for the child. I mean, just picture if you had 3 lunches with somebody and then you had to go live with them. It's difficult. And unless there's a way to make that road easier, it's very problematic. When it's done properly, there are still problems. But the disruption rate for older child adoptions is not that horrendous. Nationally, it's something like 10 to 12%. The younger the child's placed, the better the likelihood of the placement working. But believe me, there are numerous examples of children placed in that 7, 8, 9, 10-year-old range who've done incredibly well. Why have they done incredibly well? There was preparation. And there was motivation from the adoptive parent to hang in there because it is not an easy transition. That doesn't mean it's not doable, and that's where I think we as professionals have a responsibility to prepare people. Not to negate the experience, but to prepare people for the experience it really is. I really feel very strongly that we have a responsibility as professionals to look at the 500,000 children who don't have a family. So I'm delighted that you're all here, and I would be happy to answer any questions that you might have.
You know, it's interesting, Sarah, that as you may or may not know, I do the orientation at Vista. And invariably, there's hardly an orientation that goes by, and most of the people are looking for infants. And there's hardly an orientation that goes by that there isn't a question about older children. And when I explain to them a little bit about who are these older children, you can almost bank on someone saying, but there must be some children out there, you know, who are basically, they just need a home and they're really not...
Both parents were killed yesterday.
That's right.
Basically that type of thing, and that they're deprived, and those are the ones that are very hard to work with because they're looking for the needle in the haystack. Yes, there's children with difficulties, but surely you must have some without too many problems. And the interesting thing they say, gee, I don't think, and this is what I've found over the years, I really can't handle any type of physical deformity or problem, impairment. But somebody with an emotional, and because they can't see it immediately, see a cute little kid, with emotional, they think, with love and patience and hugs, they can
Very important point. You know, I think your points are very valid. We find that whenever there is a tragic car accident, my phones ring for 3 days straight from all over the country saying things like, oh, that child that, you know, the mother was whatever pushed off a bridge, I'll take that child. The other thing we have, and I don't know about the areas you all come from, in LA, usually every month we have at least one infant, newborn abandoned, thrown in a trash can. And part of what we do to find the birth parents, by law we're required to, is to do a huge media news conference. And the idea of that is that maybe if somebody's pregnant and then somebody have a baby, a relative or somebody will kind of connect where the baby was found or something and come forward. What we get, again, are maybe 100 calls from people saying, I'll take that baby. And the people who, many people, their idea of a problem is something that is easily remediated. Child needs glasses, they need orthodonture, maybe a hearing aid. And I think you're right. The idea of an emotional problem is that love conquers all. And that's where we spend a lot of time talking about what that really means. Now we're going to try, we have several hundred families waiting for what they have described to us as the perfect child. We just sent a letter to 30 of them describing real children that we have available today. And we do have real children available today. And we're curious to see what kind of response we get. And we've invited them. We're going to do some special parent groups, 8-week orientation groups, just for people who would consider these children. But I'll be interested to see. But that's why I think part of it for us as a profession is to pick up on those kinds of issues. Some people who come to us wanting an infant or also wanting a girl. That's the other thing I failed to mention. For whatever reason, everybody wants, not everybody, 90% of the families that come to us want a girl. You know, I think that one of the things that we tend to hear a lot is that girls will be sweet, girls will be easier, it's a nice way to start a family, boys have behavior problems, they should meet some of our girls. And so we find that statistically more boys are born than girls. For some reason, and maybe it's the same thing that we see with adopting families. Extended family may be more able to absorb a girl more easily. Somehow a girl does not present in terms of I'm going to be a problem to you, I'm going to be truant, I'm going to be in a gang, but we know girls can be truant and sexually promiscuous and all kinds of things. So that we have more boys available, and this is true in every part of the country that I'm aware of, in every large city. More boys are available and there's more requests for girls. Yes.
I have a question.
This is in side A. Please turn your tape over and continue in side B.
Okay, I'm saying that the estimates are very high, that children in out-of-home care at some time are physically or sexually abused, and there's a very high estimate, okay? The reason I say estimate is that for younger children, the only way, and frequently for older children, the only way you find out if this in fact has happened is that they feel free to disclose, or their behavior tells you. And if you want, when I say if you want to look the other way, you may look the other way because you don't know what you're seeing or because you want it to go away. But we do find that when children are moved to a safe environment, out of the home where the abuse has occurred, they begin to disclose either through their behavior or through their verbalization. And this is a significant enough problem that last year when the federal government was awarding grants in different areas, one of their categories was to assist in placements of sexually abused children. So it is a big issue. You know, I think the other point I would like to say in response to your statement is that there is a need to look at children's needs and to say that there is not one perfect solution for every single child that we're going to work with. Because for some children, they have been through too much in terms of disappointments, rejections, abuse. There's just too much to put them into the intimacy of a family unit and expect that to work for them. That doesn't mean adoption should be tossed out. It means for that child at this time in their life, this is not the right plan. And we as professionals need to know that just because we think adoption has value, it doesn't always have value for a particular child at a particular time in their life. We are working with a child now, an 11-year-old girl who was in two situations, a relative who was going to adopt her because of a number of problems, decided not only to not adopt her, but didn't want her in their home any longer. She was placed in an adoptive family who had some very serious health problems, and they were not willing to hang in there with her. And she really, really withdrew. She wanted no more of this adoption stuff. That was 2.5 years ago. And now, she called her old social worker and said, if you think somebody, I am now ready to try to have a family again. And it may or may not work. So I think we really need to be attuned to the fact that coming from a group home or a residential treatment setting to a family is a lot more intimate. And if we're not preparing the child and the family, just picture being one of 40 children in a good place, any place, the best place you've been to, with house parents, with structured activities, large meal times, and suddenly it's you and this man and this woman. And they're looking at you all the time. And you know, this is what they're doing because they're so happy that they have you. You want to go hide. You've lost your whole network, all your support system. No matter what happens, you're the only one that could have done it. And they're thinking how great they're going to be for you to give you intimacy and a mom and a dad, and you're not ready to deal with it. So I think for a number of reasons, it's not perfect for every child at every time. You had a second question.
Yeah, I don't know if it's too involved, but we'll find out. A close friend of mine when I was a teenager lived in a foster home down the street from me, which happened to be in Los Angeles. And we kind of became friendly in part because I was an adoptee and she was in a foster home, and it's kind of a bond because I didn't know they were adoptees. The question is that almost 30 years later, I got a letter from, well, I had been in touch with her, but I hadn't heard from her in 5 years. I got a letter from her saying that wanted to know if I believed what she just uncovered in therapy, which is that she'd been abused by her foster parents in such a severe way that she blocked out her entire childhood, and that she was lucky not to have multiple personality disorders because it had been a so-called ritualistic abuse situation. All of which blew my mind because these were the nice foster parents down the block, and this was my close friend as a teenager. But I don't know if you have these answers, but she said that when she wanted to somehow either alert, well, it's too late to alert people to other foster kids because these people are now aged and the father has died, and, you know, or foster mothers in an old age home, so it's not really that kind of situation. But she kind of wanted to connect with former foster sibling, in part to see if, just to connect, to see if she remembered the same kind of abuse. And she was told that records are thrown out every 5 years of foster placements. Is that true?
No, but it's close. I'll tell you what the difference is. All adoption records are kept forever, okay? And there's a way, but it's complicated. All adoption records are kept forever. Records for children who are in foster care, there's no requirement to keep the full record past the time that that child turns 18. But if the child was a dependent in LA County, which the child probably was, the legal file is kept forever. So there is a way to track it down through the legal file. And I'll be happy to give you some information afterwards. Yes.
I have several thousand questions here, but I'm a victim of all this system that you're talking about in some sense. And I'm trying to find a place of healing.
I'm sorry. Something is rumbling by, and I couldn't hear you. Could you?
I'm trying to find a place of peace with all that turmoil. You know, adoption brought on to me, like it's not a pleasure trip to me. I'm curious about what's being done today. Like, I know they never minimized the number of homes. I was in 12 homes before the age of 7. And it's like, you know, move on, move on, move on. And it's like, it got worse and worse, and I can hear about you shut down after a while. Do they minimize that today? Like, is there some way that you recognize that in the child? You can't keep doing that to the child.
So I think a lot of things have changed. I don't know where you grew
I
up.
mean, this is in Canada. But
That's okay. In the United States, I think that foster care, if anyone looks at all of the regulations for children, it's patchwork. And all of this was assumed to be temporary, that somebody's family for a moment or two needed some help and they'd live in a foster home and then they'd go back together again. And then people turned around and saw children growing up in foster care. They didn't go home again, and no one had made a permanent plan for their life. So in the late 70s, some legislation was passed that said, wait a minute, you know, there has to be some time frames that we put on this so that a permanent plan is made for a child's life. California, we went along on that time frame, and then about 4 years ago, a group looked at that legislation and still wasn't happy with it because they felt that it permitted too much time to elapse without making a permanent plan for children. So right now, for children who would come into care now, by the time they've been in a foster home no longer than 18 months, a permanent plan must be made for them. And at there's an 18-month hearing, and at that time, if family reunification hasn't worked, if nothing has worked, a decision is made about adoption. The law also provides that if that child is in a home, and for many children it's a foster home, where their needs are being met, they've been there for a period of time, that person has the first priority to adopt them. And I think, you know, while we do see some of our older children who were bounced around a lot, this is not happening to the degree it used to. And the other thing that's happening is I think foster parents and the courts are beginning to take a look at this isn't temporary. You know, if we're going to make a permanent plan for a child's life, it better be not bouncing the child around a lot. So I'm not going to tell you that everything is perfect, but we have come a long way in terms of recognizing what happens to children, how damaging it is to 2 months here and when you're there and when you're there and when you're there. I was speaking with a woman a few weeks ago who called me about, she had received something that she didn't think she should have. And she had adopted a child who is now 7, and she said, you know, I just got this back to school money, and I haven't gotten that from you all in many years. And so we were talking about, she was right, and I asked her how things were going. And she said, you know, I'm really happy, things are great. Little boy she adopted was 3 when he came to her home. But she said, you know, last week I was taking him to school, and we went down a road I had never been, just to avoid traffic. She said, all of a sudden he said, you know, Mom, I must have been a really bad little boy because I lived in a lot of houses before I came to you. And this is 4 years later, and she told me that she was so shocked that out of nothing, just going to school, that somehow perhaps driving down the street reminded him of a street he'd been on before, or seeing houses he didn't recognize. And so what remains with the child is very, very strong. And I think that's the other thing that we're seeing, not just in adoption practice, but in general, that, you know, I think people, I've heard my own parents will say, do you remember that? We just wanted you to remember positive things. And we'll tease and say we got it all, you know. And I think that as professionals, we're finding that children do remember. You can't put a child in a home and say, okay, pretend the rest of your life never happened, now everything's going to be great. That's part of why the preparation for both the family and the child. You know, I was at the seminar I was referring to earlier, where people talking about a life book for a child, and what an outmoded idea it is, and what we ended up talking about is maybe a life trunk. That, you know, what do you put in a book? Okay, a book is a baby book. But by the time you're 4 or 5 years old, you should have more than a life book. You should have pictures, favorite toys, a whole lot of things. Maybe a baby dress. We've placed children who will tell us, when we're talking about now where they're going to go, they'll say, I was never a baby. I don't have any baby pictures. I don't have any baby dolls. And so what we ended up talking about is placing a child with a history and a present so that they have some sense of identity. So I think, you know, a lot of that, I can see what's happened with some of our children who not only do they not know who their birth parents were, they have no first 6 years of their lives. Because that was never attended to. It was as if your life starts now. Now you're adopted, now your life starts. And that's just not true.
Just ask one more question. You mentioned with sexual abuse, and I really agree with the high percentage. I'm a victim myself. What I'm really wondering is how much process does a child get? Like, I did not have to process this at 36 years old, kind of thing. And like, you're speaking as if you know it exists. Now, how much therapy is done around the children? Like, I don't care if they open parents, I go to know about it, but I need to have some resolution
work for the children.
myself. You know what I mean? Like, you said that you want people to be open to the idea of sexual abuse, but that doesn't really resolve the abuse that the child receives. Is there some help for the child before he even goes into foster care or into adoption?
Well, see, the part of the issue is,
Because it doesn't go away.
how do we know when a child, especially a young child, the timing between when abuse may have occurred and when someone finds out about it may be a long time. First of all, depending on the age of a child, they don't know they're being sexually abused. You know, this concept that we read about teach your child about good touching and bad touching, well, those are our words. And if the only place a child is, somebody is touching them, how are they supposed to know that's bad? That's what they're experiencing. What we do find, though, is that before very long, and when I say before very long, I mean when a child gets a little bit older, they do express discomfort. And when they're with somebody that they can disclose to, frequently they do, whether it's a social worker, a teacher, or a new caretaker when they move. And even if they never do, frequently their behavior discloses because of either sexually acting out or inviting somebody to do what somebody else did, trying to orally copulate another little boy because that's what happened to them. They don't know that this is sexual abuse. In terms of treatment, we're starting to look very closely at treatment not just for the child, but for the family they're in together. Because the child needs it to sort out what's happened. And so does the family they're in, because really many of us talk about adoption as family preservation the second time around. We didn't do it the first time. The child is not with the family they were born into. But in order to give this new family unit an opportunity to stay together, that kind of intervention is necessary for everybody. The other thing we're doing in our own agency is developing 8 hours of training for all of our social workers on identifying sexual abuse, talking to a small child, looking at these behavioral indicators that you might overlook otherwise. Because most of us, I don't know where you were, I know where I went to school, I know where most of my staff did, there's not a whole lot on child sexual abuse, in depth, little clues. And then the other piece of that is intervention. What kind of therapy? Who are therapists that are really skilled in this area and working with the families?
Could it just be a safe assumption that having your children go into therapy could be good for them regardless? That it's just part of the system?
Our agency model is that we require our families do 40 hours of training before they even make a decision whether they're going to have homesteading done. And then once they make it through that process, we lose like about half the people that come in for orientation don't come back, and about 40% that go through training don't go ahead with adoption. So we lose a lot, and usually the ones that go through, we've got about a 95% success rate right now. But the program is such that they do require transition counseling from the moment of placement, and that there's a lot of work going on even during visitation, talking about, even with the child coming for visits and meeting with the social worker and just talking
Putting the
about
children
issues.
in play therapy just as part of services.
It's not just play therapy, it's transition work. We use, our model is the systems model because its entire family is impacted by the change. It's not just the child. And I think it's really unfair to expect the child to be the one that does all the changing, because every
Right.
family member has to adjust.
I would love to have it all happen. Have the
yeah.
systemic work done as well as the child has done.
Yeah, it's hard. It's hard to find a model that's going to work. This must be the end.
No, that's my beeper. Another question.
Yeah, I'm just kind of looking for some ideas. How do you interest the family? Maybe have some success stories in older children. They'd be good parents, but they're not confident, or maybe they're they need more back from the child, and the child is capable of actually giving in terms of bonding them. You want to educate them and also interest them without, setting the kid up or setting the family up.
See, I'll tell you, you're talking, you've got two issues here. One of the, I don't know how many of you have seen the book that Richard Barth did about adoption and disruptions. He's at School of Social Work at Berkeley, and he said one of the biggest relationships he found about a disruption is what he called stretching, and that is trying to talk a family into the child they didn't want, okay? And he, I had occasion to meet with him because we were working on another project together, and he was talking about the families who want to adopt, and we certainly have found this, are eager to the point of being almost obsessed, okay? And you're the professional. And so as you push, they think, well, it's like a used car salesman, you go and say, well, this is really going to be better for you. If you say, I know, they have reservations, you're the professional and you have confidence in them. I think you have to be very, very careful, because the more you push a family, the more they're feeling like, in the end, they did not get what they wanted, and their needs are not going to be met, and the child's not going to meet their expectations, and either you're going to get the child back or you're going to wish you could take the child back, because it tends to be not the right thing. And I don't know if others of you have seen the other thing, though, that I do think, depending on where the family really is, one of the things that we found helpful, not on this particular issue, but in preparing families, is introducing them to other families who've adopted, because they have a reality base and a way of sharing that's better than anything you and I can do, because they've been there. Have anyone else had this experience with the kind of...
We have a real strong support network, and it begins even before the family adopts. They do it in training, there's a support because we train groups, and then post-placement.
Yeah. But
That's what usually ends up, is that they come in, they want, the white healthy infant. They end up, and then there's so many examples of them being, just totally ecstatic about it, a 3-year-old who can't hear. And so that there is some...
because I think part of... I do too. I think we're using now more and more a process of group orientation. We're starting 3 new groups in May. And a lot of it is education. But what we find is families self-select. They'll tell you very clearly, and you need to listen to that. I think that through education, families can open up their pictures. Somebody who thought, no, I could never take 2 children may end up saying, I could take 3 children. But if you're pushing, if you're trying to override their feeling of uneasiness, you really need to listen to their feeling of uneasiness. That would be...
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'll just give you one quick example of that. Last year, I was involved in a case in San Diego where 2 children, a boy and a girl, were adopted by a family that I reviewed the whole case because it ended up in a lawsuit on behalf of the children. Anyhow, what ran through the work with the families was that the families, they on the surface appear like ideal for these 2 children, ideal, but the father objected to certain things. He thought, well, he didn't think that they should have a boy and a girl, and then the mother had certain reservations, and each of these seemed like the kind of reservations you could overcome, so the workers tried to convince them that, it really doesn't matter, and so on. And throughout the whole history of that homesteading, there were these little clues that they had reservations about it, but they weren't picked up, and they attempted to really persuade them. Okay, so about 2 years later, first one child and the other ended up in various protective services for severe sexual abuse, which wasn't picked up at all, and physical abuse. And so, the one outstanding place where they just missed with this family was in not listening to them. And I think the point is well taken. And it's not easy to do. That's the other thing. If you're involved in that, you have to know for yourself. It's going to take a lot of discipline on your part not to jump in and try to convince them. Growth will take place, and you'll get your clues from them. You want to listen to that. The other point I want to make, something I think something Sarah said about the families who want a child they couldn't have, and of course that is the problem in infant adoptions. And as you said very well, the child you couldn't have, you can't have, that's all. But with work with infant adoptions, which I think is the primary work that's done at VISTA in the adoption program, in the orientation meetings that we have, I think what we need to do is to stress more with the families that infant adoptions is not a bed of roses either. Adoption is a lifelong process. And to spell out for them just what that means. It's not the child that you could not give birth to, which is a core problem in adoption. I think we need to do more of that to present the realities of what adoption really is. And I think if we can do that more successfully, we may have families that are willing to, really look at themselves and say, well, maybe this is not exactly right for us, and so on. And open more doors for families who could accept older children adoption.
Ruben, in the last session that I attended on infertility, and a little bit in the first session, I'm hearing, and maybe it's because we're at an adoption conference, but I'm hearing adoption looked at as a crisis, that almost equates to a crisis. I don't happen to think that it's always a crisis. I see a lot of adoptees and adoptive families that are doing just fine.
So do
And
we.
that adoption is not a word that's used every single day in their life. And that's what concerns me. I don't want to build in a crises mentality, attitude, where they're anticipating this thing, where automatically they've got to be in therapy and there's got to be something wrong. The very way that you taught us at VISTA, and I don't know what's going to happen, see, like you said, there's in 1976 with the openness. I would like to think that some of the earlier problems that we've seen may either disappear or at least be ameliorated. I don't know, we'll see.
Well, we certainly hope so.
I think maybe one thing that comes to my mind when you talk about crisis is the underlying assumption that most of us have, many of us have, some people have.
Many of us have been through crisis with adoption, and if it's changing, behold, that's great. But we have people in this world right now that are suffering from the effects of adoption that wasn't handled properly. So I'm hopeful for the future, but I'm living with the past.
Is the underlying premise that the disruption of the relationship between the birth mother, the primal wound we're calling it, is sort of the beginning of the crisis?
I don't make that assumption.
That when the child is removed from the birth mother, that torn away part is the initial wound.
Yeah, I heard that at the meeting. And to me, that I just don't buy it. I think that if you operate under that assumption, there you're building in the crises. That the baby is born and that the adoptive mother doesn't smell like the birth mother. And I don't know.
I do
There's
think,
information out there, if you care to look for it, it's there. That's
I
all
think
possible.
there's another thing too, in how you look at doing the transition counseling or that work. For us, it's not because there's something wrong with anybody. I mean, we wouldn't be placing kids in homes if they were in crisis. But what we're trying to do is to educate and teach them to be the therapeutic family for a child who comes to them with a history.
That's right.
And if they don't understand what the issues are, they aren't going to be able to help the child. So that's
and I think,
all they look at.
I don't think that we see, because of the volume of adoptions we've done over the years, a whole range of things, from people who are incredibly happy with the experience they had to people who are infuriated with the experience they had. And I think that the preparation that we're doing now is part of what we learned from what didn't happen before. That, and as I say, in the same way that if you picture your own social life, that somebody would take you to lunch and the next day you have to go live with them, you'd certainly like a little bit more information. And that's kind of what we're saying, that rather than saying walk down this road together, at least we're showing where the lights are and that the road is paved. And so it's kind of, somebody used to say to me, well, it's either sink or swim. And I used to say, well, can't we at least show people where the pool is? And then give them, that much of a start. So I think there is a parameter and there's a range of issues that happen. The book I was mentioning that might be helpful is Richard Barth's book, and it was published about 1.5 years ago, and it's on older child adoptions, and provides some really good information and current research on factors that really do tend to be significant in terms of the age of a child and this phenomenon of stretching, And it's written in a way, I found it really, it's helpful and it's easy to understand. It's a very good piece, I think, a good piece.
Barth, B-A-R-T.
Barth, B-A-R-T-H, Richard Barth.
This concludes this session.